Khoridian Dominion was a civilization built on the arrogant assumption that the universe was a resource to be harvested, not a system to be respected. For 3 millennia, they had stripped stars of their cores and redirected nebulae to power their sprawling hive cities. They viewed the laws of physics as mere suggestions, until they tried to tap into the subvoid. When the drill platform Aegis 9 punctured the membrane, they didn't find infinite energy. They found the Data-Blight. It began as a shimmering distortion in the stars, a glitch in reality that simply ignored the Khoridian shields. When the blight touched a ship, the vessel didn't explode. It simply ceased to be matter. One moment, a dreadnought was a 50,000-ton marvel of engineering. The next, it was a cloud of static and raw, unformatted data. Grand Archon Kaal watched from his command throne, his 4 eyes twitching in terror as his entire blockade was deleted from the tactical map. "Send the final ultimatum to the neighboring sectors," Kaal roared, his mandibles clicking in panic. "If we fall, the galaxy falls with us." But before the message could even clear the local relay, a tiny white shuttle appeared in the center of the disaster zone. It didn't emerge from warp space, and it didn't use thrusters. It simply manifested as if it had always been there, and the universe had just forgotten to render it. The shuttle was shaped like a perfect, boring cube, and it bore a simple logo on its side: the Terran Bureau of Universal Compliance. A single human stepped out of the airlock, drifting through the vacuum without a pressurized suit. He wore a bright neon orange safety vest over a simple gray jumpsuit, and held a digital tablet that cast a soft, clinical glow on his face. This was Julian Vane, and he looked incredibly bored. "Grand Archon Kaal, I assume?" Julian's voice didn't come through the radio. It vibrated directly inside the Archon's skull, bypassing the translation matrix entirely. "Human!" Kaal hissed, gripping the arms of his throne. "You bring a shuttle to a god-killing event? We are facing the end of existence. Flee while you still can." Julian didn't even look at the massive, swirling vortex of the Data-Blight that was currently dissolving a nearby moon. He was tapping frantically at his screen, his brow furrowed. "Actually," Julian said, his tone dripping with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many code violations in one day, "you're facing a Level 7 unauthorized memory leak. And frankly, your paperwork for this sector is a disaster. Do you have any idea how many safety protocols you've bypassed to puncture this membrane?" "Safety protocols?" Kaal stammered, his primary heart skipping a beat. "The universe is dying!" Julian finally looked up, and for a split second, Kaal saw something in the human's eyes that was older than the stars, something mathematical and cold. Julian reached out and made a pinching gesture with his fingers toward the massive cosmic horror. Immediately, the Data-Blight froze. The swirling, reality-eating vortex stopped moving. The screaming static went silent. The monster wasn't dead, but it was paused. "I've put the anomaly in a temporary sandbox environment," Julian said, looking back at his tablet. "But we need to talk about your permit for localized gravity. It's expired by about 600 years. The cliffhanger hung in the frozen air of the bridge. As Julian Vane began walking toward the Archon, the Data-Blight didn't stay paused. It began to glitch, its form flickering between a monster and a string of human-readable text that said, "Fatal error. Architect required." Julian Vane was in no hurry. He moved through the bridge of the Aegis 9 with the distracted air of a man looking for a misplaced set of keys, entirely ignoring the hysterical panic of the Khoridian elite. To the Dominion officers, the Data-Blight was the wrath of a god. To Julian, it was just a poorly optimized software launch on the galaxy's aging hardware. He stepped past a row of towering gold statues that Grand Archon Kaal had erected in his own honor, pulled a red permanent marker from his vest pocket, and drew a large, aggressive X across the primary gravity stabilizer, a console encrusted with priceless star diamonds. Kaal rose from his throne, his primary mandibles trembling with a volatile mix of fury and primal dread. He roared at the human, demanding to know how a primitive creature dared to deface the property of a species that commanded 1,000 suns. Julian didn't even look up from his tablet. He simply noted that the commanders of 1,000 suns had managed to create a reality void the size of a small nebula because they hadn't bothered to install basic entropy filters. He officially classified the flagship as unfit for biological habitation and logged a formal complaint against the Dominion's blatant disregard for the fundamental stability of the sector. When Kaal finally lost his patience and ordered his guards to seize the intruder, Julian tapped a single command on his touchscreen: Instantly, all kinetic energy in the room was toggled to read-only mode. The guards who had lunged at him froze midair, looking like flies trapped in amber. Their movements became a stuttering sequence of frames where every inch gained took several minutes of real-time processing. Julian walked calmly through the frozen soldiers, explaining that he had temporarily restricted physical interaction permissions for all entities with a sub-administrative intelligence level. He wasn't a soldier. He was the Cosmic System Administrator, and he was currently performing a mandatory safety audit. Julian walked to the massive observation port where the paused Data-Blight looked like a jagged, broken sculpture made of obsidian glass. He explained to the stunned Archon that this sector of space was running on archaic algorithms, and the Dominion's illegal drilling had caused a buffer overflow in reality. To fix it, Julian would have to reformat the local spacetime. The problem, he noted dryly, was that formatting typically wiped all existing data, including the trillions of souls living in the Dominion, unless they had a verified cloud backup on the Terran primary server. Since the Khoridians had spent the last century mocking human bureaucracy, their backup status was currently listed as null. Suddenly, the station shuddered with a force that made even Julian grab a nearby railing for support. The sandbox environment he had used to trap the Data-Blight began to wash out into white noise and flickering digital artifacts. The black ichor inside the creature began to shift into familiar shapes. Archaic human code that hadn't been used for millions of years, predating the era when Earth became the primary server. Julian's bored expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. This wasn't a random glitch caused by Khoridian ignorance. This was a targeted system intrusion. The Data-Blight began to broadcast a sound through the ship's internal speakers, a voice that perfectly mimicked Julian's own tone and cadence. On the human's tablet, a blood-red notification flashed over the screen, overriding his controls. The message was simple and final. Admin password changed. New directive. Delete system operator. Julian realized in that moment that he no longer held the keys to the universe. Someone else had just seized root access to the galaxy. The bridge of the Aegis 9 began to scream. Not with the sound of alarms, but with the high-pitched whine of reality losing its resolution. The floorboards beneath Grand Archon Kaal's throne flickered between solid metal and wireframe outlines, and the stars outside the view screen began to smear like wet paint on a canvas. The Data-Blight was no longer a monster trapped in a sandbox. It was a corruption spreading through the local directory of the universe. Julian Vane stared at his tablet, his thumb hovering over a frozen screen that now displayed a mocking, rotating icon of a skull made of binary code. He wasn't bored anymore. For the first time in 3 centuries, a human administrator had been locked out of his own sector. "Archon, get off that throne!" Julian commanded, his voice cutting through the digital static like a blade. The read-only stasis he had placed on the guards shattered as the Blight overrode his local permissions. The Khoridian warriors collapsed to the floor, coughing as their lungs struggled to remember how to process oxygen that was rapidly being recalculated into argon. Kaal scrambled back, his 4 eyes fixed on the view screen where the Data-Blight had begun to unzip the flagship's hull. The monster was reaching through the metal as if it were nothing more than a suggestion, its limbs turning the ship's structural integrity into a list of broken variables. Julian didn't panic. He reached into the air in front of him, his hand disappearing into a fold of space that shouldn't have been there. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, he was reaching for the hardware layer. While the Khoridians had built their empire on the software of technology, engines, shields, and beams, humanity had spent eons mapping the firmware of the cosmos. Julian's fingers closed around a shimmering, translucent rod of pure white light that manifested out of the void. It was a physical manifestation of a kernel override, a tool that bypassed the tablet, the interface, and the laws of physics entirely. "You think a password change stops the architect?" Julian whispered, his eyes flashing with a cold, violet light. He slammed the rod into the floor of the bridge. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of white light erupted from the point of impact, washing over the ship and the surrounding space. It wasn't an explosion, it was a hard reset. For a fraction of a second, everything went black. Total, absolute nothingness. Then the universe re-rendered. The floor became solid. The air returned to oxygen. The smeared stars outside snapped back into perfect, pinpoint focus. The Data-Blight shrieked, a sound like 1,000 hard drives crashing at once, as the white light forced it back into a localized, stable form. Julian stood in the center of the bridge, the white rod glowing in his hand. His tablet was back online, but it was scrolling through millions of lines of error logs at a speed no biological eye could follow. He told the terrified Archon that the intrusion wasn't coming from the void membrane they had punctured. The Data-Blight was a Trojan horse, a piece of malicious code hidden inside the very star-drilling technology the Khoridians had discovered decades ago. Someone had intentionally given the Dominion the tools to break the universe, just so they could watch the admin log in to fix it. The Archon stammered, asking who would do such a thing. Julian didn't answer. He was looking at a specific line of code on his screen that was blinking in a language even he barely recognized. It was a signature from a user who had been deleted from the system a billion years ago. The cliffhanger hit as the station's sensors picked up a massive second fleet dropping out of hyperspace. They weren't Khoridian, and they weren't Terran. They were sleek, silver needles that didn't appear on radar because they were using developer cloaking. A new voice broke through the silence of the bridge, a voice that sounded like a chorus of 1,000 different species speaking in perfect unison. It said, "Step aside, admin. We've come to reclaim the source code." The silver needle ships of the sovereign arbiters did not drift. They sliced through the vacuum with a mathematical perfection that made the Khoridian fleet look like primitive driftwood. On the bridge of the Aegis 9, the air grew cold. Not the cold of a failing life support system, but the sterile, absolute zero of a void that had been scrubbed of all biological warmth. These were the legacy users, a species that had ascended to a higher plane of existence a billion years ago, leaving behind the star-drilling technology as a trap for lesser civilizations. They viewed the galaxy as their private server, and they had returned to perform a factory reset. Grand Archon Kaal fell to his knees as the chorus of 1,000 voices filled his mind, a psychic pressure that threatened to liquefy his brain. But Julian Vane stood unmoved, his neon orange vest glowing defiantly against the silver light bleeding through the viewscreen. He didn't look at the arbiters with awe. He looked at them with the simmering resentment of a technician who had just been paged at 3 a.m. to fix a problem he didn't create. He tapped a sequence into his tablet, and a massive, semi-transparent wall of scrolling text, thousands of pages of universal terms and conditions, manifested in the air between the bridge and the invading fleet. Julian addressed the silver ships not as gods, but as unauthorized third-party developers. His voice, amplified by the station's remaining subroutines, informed the arbiters that their guest access had officially expired during the last great expansion. He cited Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Terran Stability Accords. Any species that abandons their physical directory for more than 10 million cycles forfeits all administrative rights to the local hardware. The arbiters responded by firing a beam of pure de-resolution light, a weapon designed to disassemble the atoms of anything it touched. The beam hit the Aegis 9, but instead of vaporizing the ship, it simply hit Julian's wall of text and bounced off, refiled by the system as non-critical background noise. Julian turned his attention back to the trembling Archon Kaal. He informed the Khoridian leader that while the legacy users were a high-priority security threat, the Dominion itself was still under audit for the initial sub-void breach. He handed the digital tablet to the Archon, showing him a list of fines that made Kaal's primary heart stop. The fine for reality disturbance wasn't measured in gold or energy credits. It was measured in system resources. To pay for the energy required to patch the hole they had drilled into the universe, the Khoridian Dominion was being ordered to surrender 90% of its fleet's kinetic output and its entire planetary power grid for the next 50 cycles. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an involuntary system tax. The Sovereign Arbiters, realizing that their developer commands were being ignored by the human admin, began to glitch out of the visual spectrum, preparing to attack the galaxy's source code directly from the BIOS layer. Julian sighed, muttering about how much he hated legacy software that refused to uninstall. He told the Archon to brace for a sector-wide defragmentation. He explained that he was about to move every planet, star, and ship in the system into a virtual partition, while he reformatted the space the Arbiters occupied. If the Dominion didn't comply with the tax immediately, they wouldn't be moved into the safe partition. They would be left in the trash bin during the wipe. The cliffhanger struck as Julian reached for the primary system override lever on his tablet. Outside, the very stars began to shift, moving like icons being dragged across a desktop. But as the defragmentation process began, A new error message flashed in giant neon red letters across every screen in the sector. It didn't come from the Arbiters, and it didn't come from Julian. It was a core overheat warning from Earth itself. The primary server was crashing. Julian looked at the readout, his face going pale for the first time. "The firewall didn't just break here," he whispered. "Someone just pulled the plug on the sun." The silence that followed the core overheat warning was more terrifying than the shrieks of the Data-Blight. On the bridge of the Aegis 9, every light turned a deep, pulsating crimson, and the artificial gravity began to fluctuate, making the air feel heavy one second and non-existent the next. Julian Vane stared at his tablet, his eyes scanning through cascading failures that spanned the entire Sol system. The Sovereign Arbiters hadn't just attacked the Khoridian sector, they had sent a logic bomb directly to Earth's primary fusion core, attempting to force quit the human species. Human? What is happening? Grand Archon Kaal screamed, clutching his throat as the oxygen scrubbers began to stutter. "Our sun, our stars, the light is fading." Julian didn't answer immediately. He was entering a string of commands into his tablet with a speed that made his fingers a blur. "They're trying to delist us," he muttered, more to himself than to the Archon. "They think if they pull the power on the primary server, the whole galaxy defaults back to their old save state. Arrogant bastards." He suddenly slammed a final Enter key on his screen. Immediately, a blue holographic grid expanded from Julian's position, sweeping across the bridge and out into the void. This was the Emergency Environment Partition. It wasn't a shield, it was a localized compatibility layer. Outside, the stars didn't come back, but the Aegis 9 stopped vibrating. The air stabilized. The gravity returned to a perfect, comfortable 1G. Julian had just turned the entire flagship into a safe mode environment. Seeing Julian seemingly distracted by the crisis, Archon Kaal's fear was momentarily eclipsed by his predatory greed. He signaled his remaining elite guards. If the human's primary server was falling, then the human was vulnerable. If Kaal could seize that tablet, he could potentially become the new admin of a dying universe. The guards lunged, their ceremonial spears glowing with concentrated plasma, aiming directly for Julian's head. Julian didn't even look up from his work. "Protocol 404. Physical collision disabled," he said quietly. The plasma spears passed directly through Julian's body as if he were a ghost. The guards followed, their momentum carrying them through the space he occupied, only for them to stumble and fall on the other side. They tried to grab him, but their hands slid through his plaid-covered shoulders like mist. Julian had revoked their permission to intersect with his coordinate space. To the universe, for the next 10 minutes, Julian Vane was no-clip enabled. "I'm busy, Kaal," Julian said, his voice cold and echoing. "The Arbiters just tried to delete my home. You trying to steal my iPad is a minor background task I don't have time to process." Julian reached into the air and pulled out a shimmering spectral keyboard. He began live patching the galaxy. On the view screen, the silver needle ships of the Arbiters began to spin out of control. They weren't being shot. They were being recategorized. Julian was changing their ship class from destroyer to stationary decorative prop. One by one, the mighty Arbiter vessels lost their engines, their weapons, and their ability to move, frozen in space as harmless silver ornaments. "You can't do this," the chorus of 1,000 voices shrieked through the ship's comms. "We are the creators. We wrote the laws." "You wrote the beta version," Julian snapped back, his violet eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "Humanity did the bug fixes and the security updates for the last billion years. You're deprecated. Now sit still while I reboot the sun." The cliffhanger struck as Julian's tablet displayed a progress bar. Soul recovery, 15%. But as the sun began to flicker back to life, a new, much larger shadow appeared on the sensors. Not a ship, but a developer window opening in the sky. A massive celestial hand, made of pure code, reached down from the stars, aiming directly for the Aegis 9. The Arbiters weren't just a species, they were a system restore point, and the universe was trying to overwrite Julian's existence. The celestial hand descending from the developer window was not made of flesh, but of shimmering, cascading strings of violet hex code. It was a system restore operation on a galactic scale, a cold, automated attempt by the universe's ancient firmware to overwrite the human error and return the sector to its factory settings. As the fingers of code began to wrap around the Aegis 9, the ship's hull didn't crush. It began to turn transparent, its physical properties being replaced by raw metadata. Grand Archon Kaal watched his hands begin to pixelate into glowing dust. "It is over," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The creators are reclaiming the world. We are being deleted." Julian Vane didn't look at the hand. He was staring at his tablet where the Sol recovery bar had stalled at 18%. The Arbiters weren't just attacking. They were trying to initiate a rollback to a version of reality before humans had discovered the source code. Julian let out a sharp, jagged breath and did something that made the Archon's secondary stomach turn to ice. He reached up to his own neck and pulled a thin, glowing fiber optic thread directly out of the base of his skull. "This isn't a factory reset," Julian said, his voice now sounding like 1,000 overlapping processor fans. "This is a hostile takeover by a deprecated legacy species. And they've forgotten who holds the root password." He plugged the thread into the Aegis 9's primary data core. Instantly, the bridge vanished. In its place was an infinite pitch-black void filled with towering pillars of glowing text. The root directory of the galaxy. Kaal found himself floating in a space where every star was a folder, and every sentient life form was a single line of code. At the very center of this digital cathedral stood a massive, pulsating golden sun, labeled OS_core SOL. Julian pointed toward the golden core. He explained to the terrified Archon that Earth was never just a planet. It was the primary server room, the physical location where the reality engine was housed. Humans hadn't evolved on a death world. They had been installed there to act as a biological firewall, a species capable of high-speed problem-solving and aggressive adaptation to protect the hardware from the very things that were currently attacking. "Look at the timestamp, Kaal," Julian said, gesturing to a scrolling log of system reboots. Kaal's eyes widened as he saw the numbers. The galaxy hadn't existed for 13 billion years. It had existed for 6 quadrillion cycles, but it had been rebooted 12 times. Each time the Arbiters had tried to reclaim control, and each time humanity had fought them back into the trash bin of history. This wasn't a war, it was a recurring maintenance cycle. The celestial hand of the Arbiters finally breached the root directory, its violet code bleeding into the golden light of Sol. The system restore was beginning to overwrite the current timeline. Julian's plaid shirt began to dissolve, revealing a suit of liquid data armor beneath it. He stepped forward, his hands grasping 2 pillars of code, one representing gravity, the other representing time. "I'm initiating a manual defragmentation," Julian announced. "I'm going to move every star system in this quadrant into a temporary cache. While they're there, I'm going to purge the Arbiter's signature from the BIOS. But what happens to us?" Kaal shrieked as his own data string began to flicker. "You're going to experience a bit of lag," Julian replied grimly. He slammed the 2 pillars together. The root directory exploded into a blinding white light. Outside the virtual space, the Aegis 9 and every planet in the Khoridian Dominion began to vibrate with such intensity that they blurred out of existence. They were being moved. But as Julian began the purge, he saw something in the Arbiter's code that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a legacy command, it was a user invite. The cliffhanger struck as Julian realized the Arbiters weren't the ones who had initiated the rollback. They were just the guest users. Someone else, a super user from a different galaxy entirely, had just sent a Format C command to the entire Milky Way. And the progress bar was already at 99%. The sky above the Khoridian homeworld didn't turn black. It turned white. The sterile, terrifying white of an unformatted drive. The 99% complete progress bar was the only thing visible in the heavens. A cosmic death sentence written in a language that made the sovereign Arbiters look like children playing with blocks. The super user from the Andromeda partition had sent a final wipe command, intending to reclaim the Milky Way's raw matter for its own expansion. To Grand Archon Kaal, this was the literal end of time. To Julian Vane, it was the ultimate hostile acquisition. The bar. "It's not moving," Kaal whispered, his scales gray with shock as he stared at the frozen 99% hanging over his world. "Why has it stopped?" Julian didn't answer. He was currently standing in the center of the bridge, his liquid data armor pulsing with a blinding golden light that was siphoning energy directly from the Aegis 9's core. The fiber optic thread in his neck was glowing so brightly it was translucent. He wasn't just typing commands anymore, he was manually holding the delete command back. His hands were outstretched, grasping invisible strands of the universe's BIOS, his muscles straining as if he were physically holding back a collapsing mountain. "I can't," Delete the command, Julian grunted, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. The super user has higher privilege levels, but I can refactor it. He explained to the terrified crew that he couldn't stop the format command, but he could change the target path. Instead of letting the wipe command delete the entire Milky Way, he was going to compress the entire Khoridian sector into a read-only archive and use the energy of their sun as a temporary buffer. He wasn't saving their system. He was turning it into a patch note to be inserted back into reality once he rebooted the primary server. The cost, however, was total. The Khoridian sun would have to be reformatted, converted from a fusion-based star into a pure data battery. With a final guttural roar, Julian slammed his hands together. The 99% bar didn't finish. It shattered into a million pieces of glowing green text. Outside, the Khoridian sun didn't explode. It turned perfectly, geometrically square. A massive cubical star now sat in the center of their system, pulsing with a cold blue light that didn't provide heat but provided uptime. The entire sector was suddenly encased in a shimmering blue quarantine bubble, separating it from the rest of the galaxy. Julian collapsed to the floor, the data armor receding into his gray jumpsuit. The celestial hand from the stars was gone, blocked by the new firewall he had just hot-patched into existence. He looked at his tablet, which was now displaying a single golden notification. Local sector archived. Galaxy reboot initiated. We're safe? Kaal asked, reaching out to touch the now solid air of the bridge. You're in a zip file, Kaal, Julian panted, wiping sweat and liquid code from his forehead. You're safe from the wipe, but you're currently a non-executable entity. I've quarantined the Data-Blight and the Arbiters inside this bubble with you. They're stuck in an infinite loop while I go to the root and finish the job. Julian stood up, looking at the square sun. He told the Archon that Stage 7 was complete. The quarantine was holding. But Stage 8, the final audit, required him to physically travel to the Sol server room and confront the super user's source code directly. He warned them that while he was gone, time inside the bubble would move differently. Cycles would pass in seconds. If he failed at the root, the zip file would be deleted permanently. The cliffhanger struck as Julian's shuttle began to manifest inside the bridge, ready to take him to the galaxy's core. But as he stepped inside, the square sun outside began to turn red. A new message appeared on his tablet, one that bypassed all his encryption. It was a simple, polite chat window from the extragalactic superuser. Nice try, admin, but we just found your backup server. We're erasing Earth now. The server room of the universe was not a physical location, but a conceptual layer where the math of existence was laid bare. Julian Vane stepped out of his shuttle and onto a floor made of pure, solidified logic. Above him, the Sol server was a titanic, pulsing sun of golden data, now flickering dangerously as the Andromeda superuser's deletion command reached its final stage. On the horizon of this digital void, a massive, shadowy silhouette, the extragalactic superuser, loomed like a mountain, its fingers already deep into the Milky Way's core directory. Admin Vane, the superuser's voice boomed, vibrating through the very fabric of Julian's soul. Your partition is bloated, inefficient, and filled with human errors. It is time for a clean install. Step aside and let the expansion proceed. Julian didn't step aside. He reached into his neon orange safety vest and pulled out a small, physical object that looked like a rusted iron key. It was a legacy hard key, the only piece of physical hardware left from the first boot of the universe. He looked at the 99% deletion bar hanging over Earth and let out a short, tired laugh. He told the superuser that while Andromeda might have higher privilege levels, they had made the classic mistake of every high-level executive. They had forgotten how the ground floor actually worked. You think this is just a partition? Julian shouted, his voice echoing through the root directory. You think humans are just errors in your code? We aren't the software, you arrogant piece of legacy bloat. We are the heat sinks. Julian slammed the iron key into a shimmering pedestal at the center of the room. Instantly, the golden light of the Sol server turned a fierce, blinding purple. This was the hardwired override. He explained that humanity's death world was never a mistake. It was a torture test designed to create a species whose neural pathways were compatible with the universe's most volatile subroutines. Humans were the only processes capable of running at 100% capacity without melting the hardware. As the deletion command hit 100%, the superuser let out a triumphal roar, expecting the Milky Way to vanish into ash. But instead of a wipe, a massive glowing prompt appeared in the center of the universe. Unauthorized action blocked. Permission denied by local hardware. Julian had upgraded the entire galaxy to a self-aware firewall. He hadn't just blocked the wipe, he had revoked the Andromeda superuser's administrative rights across the entire local cluster. On the view screen of the Aegis 9 back in the quarantined Khoridian sector, Grand Archon Kaal watched as the square sun turned back into a brilliant golden orb. The blue zip file bubble dissolved, and the stars snapped back into their proper positions. The Sovereign Arbiters and the Data-Blight didn't just disappear, they were compressed into a single harmless data log that Julian labeled as educational material for future admins. "What have you done?" the superuser shrieked, its shadow beginning to fade as the Milky Way's new security protocols pushed it back into its own galactic partition. "I've put us on a subscription plan," Julian replied, looking at his tablet one last time. "If you want to access this galaxy's resources, you'll have to go through the Terran Bureau of Universal Compliance. And our terms of service are very, no more wipes, no more reboots, and no more playing God without a permit." The final audit was complete. Julian Vane stood in the quiet of the root directory as the Sol server stabilized into a steady, warm glow. He tapped a final command, and his shuttle manifested to take him back to Earth. He told the universe that Stage 8 was finished, and the varsity team was now officially the permanent management. The story concluded not with an explosion, but with a return to normalcy. Back on the Aegis 9, Grand Archon Kaal was handed a digital invoice for the reality restoration services provided by humanity. The cost was high, but the Archon signed it without hesitation. He had learned that in a universe of gods and monsters, it was the man with the clipboard and the safety vest who truly held the power. Julian Vane returned to his small office on Earth, sat down at a desk that hadn't moved in 1,000 years, and took a long sip of lukewarm coffee. He looked at the annoyance protocol sign on his wall, reached out, and flipped it over. The other side simply said, "Under new management, please keep the reality clean."